Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we will be hearing about the book The Great Scourge and How to End It by Christabel Pankhurst, and it's being discussed by Helen Pringle. So this is the book, and here's Helen. So welcome, Helen Pringle, and over to you.
Thank you, Jo. I'm sitting in Australia. I'm in Sydney. I live in the suburb of Coogee in Sydney in Australia. And I'm committed to the practice on formal occasions of acknowledgement of the Indigenous owners and stewards of this land, which in my case are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge and honour the Indigenous women who are subject to the scourge of genocide throughout Australia. I also want to say a loud hello to my Spanish sisters who are listening, and huge congratulations on the World Cup, but even more for standing firm against Senor Rubiales in defence of Jenny. I noticed that in his latest pathetic hard luck story, he made note of the false feminism, which is a great scourge of this country. I think when he uses the word scourge, I'm not sure what he means. It doesn't mean anything good, obviously, but I think that the word scourge in English has lost a lot of its power over the years. And I have always thought that scourge meant something like a plague or a disturbance that troubled people in a society, that made them irritated or troubled, whatever. But in fact, it once had much stronger connotations of torture and cruelty, of vicious lashings and lacerations of bodies, of the destruction of bodies through the scourge, which was accomplished through the whip, for example. And I'm talking this evening, it's my time this evening, about Christabel Pankhurst's book, The Great Scourge and How to End It, which was published in 1913. As far as I know, scourge, the word scourge, retained those older meanings when she was writing. And I'd like everyone to remember when thinking about what she says about the great scourge. And it's a great scourge that still afflicts us in the way that she described it as a scourge. It was a scourge of women, and this scourge and the contours that she sets out of the scourge are things that still not only trouble us, but afflict us and make us suffer, and make us suffer in various ways. At the time that she wrote the book, Christabel, and I'm going to call her Christabel not out of disrespect, but because there was more than one Pankhurst who I might be referring to, Christabel was a leading figure in the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. She was the oldest child of Emmeline Pankhurst and born in Manchester in 1880. She was followed by sisters Sylvia and a brother Frank and another sister Adela. Adela came to Australia, so we sort of claim her as our own in some ways. Christabel's own career as a suffragette kicked off with the arrest of her and Annie Kenney at a speech of Sir Edward Grey in London. I'll just ask Jo if you could put the second slide on, there's Christabel in a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, and with the colours, of course. And the second slide shows her with Annie Kenney in 1905. Yeah. I'm holding a sign, Votes for Women. At this time of that photo was taken, the second photo was taken, it's in 1905, and Christabel, who's on the right of the photo as facing you, along with her hands on the sign, Christabel was had been arrested for, and Annie Kenney also, who's with her, had been arrested at a speech of Sir Edward Grey, who was a government minister in London. They went to a meeting that he was chairing, and they were very disruptive. They made a lot of noise and were very disorderly. They were removed. The police asked them to leave, and they refused to leave, and the police then arrested them, and it was a typical police arrest. Both the original offence plus being disorderly, resisting arrest and so forth, including in Christabel's case, kicking and spitting at the arresting police. When they were brought on trial, Christabel said in a speech in her speech from the dock, she said, "I am only sorry that one of them, that's the policeman whom she assaulted, I'm only sorry that one of them was not Sir Edward Grey himself. We cannot make any orderly protest because we have not the means whereby citizens can do such a thing. We don't have a vote, and as long as we don't have a vote, we must be disorderly." And this is a very familiar territory, I think, a very familiar argument for people. Without the vote, they are without power, and therefore the means that they adopt to agitate for power, for votes can, because you can't agitate for votes if you don't have a vote, except in a disorderly way. Both women were found guilty and fined, and Christabel, like Annie Kenney, was jailed after refusing to pay the fine. Up to that point, it's a very familiar story, and probably quite well known, I think, at least if it's not well known in regard to Christabel herself specifically. Sorry, I'm just looking down at the chat. I shouldn't do that, but I did, and it says, "May we all be disorderly women." Here. But this part of Christabel's story is well known, and it's a fairly typical story of a suffragette's progress at this time. It concerned a struggle for the votes for women. There's no question of the supreme importance of the vote for the suffragette movement throughout the time of the agitation. But for Christabel Pankhurst and for others, but of her I'm talking, that was only half of it. So her slogan was votes for women, but it also was "and chastity for men." So the slogan was votes for women and chastity for men, not just votes for women. And it often troubles me or puzzles me that, or I wonder why that latter part, "and chastity for men," has dropped out of accounts of the suffragettes. Why do we hear so little about "and chastity for men"? I think one of the reasons is that we, whoever we is in this case, maybe I can include myself as well here for a time as well, we became afraid of being called Puritans and wowsers. We became afraid, terrified even, of being called man-haters. And we became afraid of being called out for being against sex, whatever that means. I don't know. I've never met anybody who, when you ask them, "Are you against sex?" most of them just look at you and say, "What a kind of question is that? What are you actually asking?" But this is a terrifying kind of thing, to be told that you are against sex. It means that you won't be heard. Your voice will be silenced. It is a way, I think, of silencing people. It was not just a criticism of us now, so it has a lot of longevity, that those things to say about us, but it was a very common criticism of Christabel even at the time she wrote the little book on the Great Scourge, this book that I'm talking about, The Great Scourge, and how to find out how to end it, rather. For shame, also many of those criticisms came from women, like Rebecca West, for example. Many women today even disparage the suffragettes on precisely this ground. An article that I read a little while ago quoted Christabel's full slogan and added, in a very snide way, "This says it all." I agree, it says it all, but not in the tone in which that person criticised the phrase. And so what I want to do was in talking about the book, talk a little bit about what did it mean? What does it say to say "and chastity for men"? Also, just to note in passing, and I think this is an important note in passing, however, that the slogan was not "votes for women and chastity for all." Christabel did not argue for chastity for all. She argued for chastity for men. It wasn't a general call to chastity. Also, I don't want to get into a linguistic discussion here, but I think you find that chastity, when she used the term chastity, she didn't mean what many Americans seem to think it means in that way. So what does she mean by calling for chastity for men? It's not at all clear, actually, that this is a sexually puritanical claim. Rather, in her mind, it's a call for an end to the sexual subordination and damage of women. There's absolutely no evidence that Christabel or the suffragettes generally appreciated intimacy or beauty or love any the less than anyone else. I actually often wonder if they'd been asked outright, what do you think of the mutuality of sexual pleasure and delight? They might have replied like Gandhi, I think it would be a very good idea. Probably they would have been, I don't know that they would necessarily have talked about pleasure. I think pleasure tends to be a way that men talk about sex, but they probably would have talked more about delight, which I think is more, a way that I find more congenial, at least, to talk about sex, mutual delight. So Christabel's slogan was not about abolishing sex, but fundamentally, and she's very clear about this, about abolishing prostitution. She didn't call it the prostitution system, which I would today, but she talked about abolishing prostitution. When she advocated chastity for men, she explained that what she meant was that men should be held to the same standard of sexual behaviour as women, their observance of the same moral standard as is observed by women. To do that, according to Christabel, required the abolition of prostitution, no less. And she elaborated on this argument in relation to the problem of venereal disease. And I'll try to set this out by explaining her argument about venereal disease, VD, and its significance. But while I'm talking about venereal disease, the central focus of her argument in the book, as far as I understand it, in my view, is on prostitution, not on venereal disease. So the book begins by noting the dimensions of the hidden scourge. And the hidden scourge, as she calls it at times, hidden scourge is the scourge of VD, of venereal disease. It's clear to her, to Christabel, that this is not just a physical disease, but a political one. So she says about her book, one of the chief objects of the book is to enlighten women as to the true reason why there's opposition to giving them the vote. That reason is sexual vice. And again, when we kind of hear sexual vice, when we hear the term vice and virtue, they set off those old-fashioned alarm bells in our mind. And I think that's the wrong way, that we're reading that a little bit wrongly if we think of it as a kind of moralistic type of argument. She doesn't mention God at any part, for example, throughout this book, about what God's view is about what we do in our sexual lives, our intimate lives. She goes on to say, the opponents of votes for women know that women, when they are politically free and economically strong, will not be purchasable for the base uses of vice. Those who want to have women as slaves obviously do not want to have women become voters. In terms of venereal disease, Christabel estimated that most men had it. Either they had gonorrhea, or they had syphilis, or they had both. And she was roundly criticised, again by other women, particularly at the time, for overestimating the rate of VD. It does sound, at first, I think, like a rather reasonable sort of thing to criticise, given that her estimation was that around 75% of men were infected with gonorrhea and around 20% with syphilis. There is a time in my own reading and life, etc., that I would have been sceptical about those figures as well, but I'm not anymore. One example is from the Australian Army. The Australian Army in the Great War, the First World War, for example, is described by Peter Stanley, who's an official historian for the War Memorial, was an official historian. He said that he writes in his book about the Australian Army as a chapter specifically on this topic, and he says around half of the enlisted men contracted VD. And then he says they proceeded to infect the other half by seeing prostitutes. People don't see prostitutes, but anyway, or visiting a brothel. As if, you visit a brothel, you sort of go and can we come and have afternoon tea with you? Can we come and visit? These euphemisms that we use for prostitution, of seeing and visiting and so forth. And Peter Stanley estimated that this one half of the Australian Army who was infected with VD then proceeded to infect the other half by cycling the VD through a brothel, so that they infected the women in the brothel, who then infected the other half of the army who came to visit them in that way. One of the things that you can I don't want to depart too far from Christabel Pankhurst. One of the things that you can do when you look at the records in the National Archives of Australia is to look through the records of men's army records, and always you can see whether they're medical records and whether they suffered from it. It's very hard to find anybody who, I've never seen more than one record, for example, that doesn't note that the man in question, including my own grandfather, had venereal disease. Other sorts of examples, when you look at the criminal records in London, and you look at the child abuse, for example, and you look at the incidence of venereal disease among children who've been abused. A good example here is Mr. Clarence. Mr. Clarence was the person at issue in 1888 when the court decided that a man laid down that a man could not rape his wife, that he couldn't rape his wife because his wife was not able to be raped by her husband in that way. Mr. Clarence, it's less well known, also had a daughter whom he'd infected with VD, as well as his wife. So once you begin to take that claim a little bit more seriously than just dismissing it, it does, I think it does have a lot. I don't think it's quite as ridiculous as it's, or not anywhere near as ridiculous as it's described by some of the critics, her estimates of that. Another person who had made a criticism of Christabel in this case was the poet Ezra Pound, the anti-Semitic poet Ezra Pound, who called her a nitwit for this reason. Christabel talks about also, when she's talking about prostitution, she talks about the man prostitute, which is kind of, I've never come across anybody doing that before. She talks about the man prostitute, and she says, for why should we give this name only to the woman partner? And she says, I call him the man prostitute, and I'll call for prostitution. And she says, prostitution has to go. In other words, has to be abolished. She acknowledges that this won't be a popular position. She acknowledges that she says, the usual balderdash about human nature and injury to men's health would be bandied about, as well as noting how some medicinal cures for VD were being discovered by men. So men were sort of saying, oh, we'll find the cure and then we'll be all right. We won't have to worry anymore. We can do what we always did without any of the repercussions that were obviously an injury to their health, they didn't care about the women, would be bandied about. As well as, she also says that they've also discovered a political cure for VD, and that men, in other words, men buyers, men in general, have decided that they can find a physical cure, and this will solve many of their problems, that they won't be infected by VD, by those prostitutes, as they call them, whores. But Christabel says, but they also are on the way to discovering a political cure for VD. And she says that the political cure is the state licensing of prostitution. In other words, the system that we have in place in New South Wales, the system that's in place in any country where prostitution is legalized, where you have the state licensing and regulation and laying the basis in law, policy, courts, etc., for the well-functioning of the prostitution system. She says, this is the political cure for prostitution that has been proposed by men, which is the state regulation and recognition of vice. So this system of state licensing, when it was perfected and when it was starting to be implemented in Christabel's time, involved confining women to certain areas. In other words, zoning, what we call zoning. And these women who would be zoned would be periodically inspected, perhaps once or twice a week, in order to see whether they were diseased. And if diseased, they would be isolated and treated. And then men would again begin the task of making them diseased all over again. That's a quotation from Christabel. In other words, what she's saying is it was just a control measure, a control of women, in order to allow men to continue on their practices of the prostitution of women. She says, in response to this. Against any such system, that is the licensing, women will fight to the very death. No woman's slavery of this kind can be tolerated at this time of day. If men venture to re-establish in this country a system according to which certain women will be segregated, controlled, and medically examined for the purpose of vice, that will mean the establishment of a sex war. I expect everybody's saying in the comments, bring it on. Unfortunately, we don't say bring it on too often. We tend to think, leave behind women in prostitution and think of them as something that we don't really have to account for, that are not us too, but that really fall a little bit by the wayside so often in terms of the focus of our attention in regard to feminism and feminist reform. A good example here of this type of regulation, which is not so far at all from what is, I mean, the way that Christabel explains it makes it sound as if it's a very different measure from what is in place in New South Wales, which is the state of Australia where I live, and other states and other countries. It makes it sound like this is a very cruel and harsh regime. It is, but our particular system or a particular variant of that is no less harsh and cruel. It's just not felt as that by women who aren't in prostitution. So, as an example here, Christabel writes about the maintenance of brothels in India for the British Army and Navy, by which she says the government plays the role of procurers of women for the vicious pleasures of men in the armed forces. It's kind of like Kat Bunyard's book, The Pimp State. That's what she's referring to. So the state procures the women, cleans the women up, and puts them there for the vicious pleasures of men. There's that word pleasure again. And then the men can infect them, and then they're cleaned up again and recycled and so forth. And then the men go home to the first class of women, their wives or partners. We talk about nowadays, the comfort women, so-called comfort women, I should say, at the service of the Japanese army in the Second World War, which has never been put on trial, and has never been subject to any kind of, or really any kind of reparation beyond a few dollars here and there, or a few yen here and there. And I think we're familiar about that, of that practice of the state procuring women for the vicious pleasures of men in the armed forces. But and the main example is the Japanese army in the Second World War. But this was a long established practice of the British Army, both at home and abroad. Again, sorry, I know I shouldn't look at the chat, but somebody says I feel fury at that word comfort. I do too. I'm sorry that it's become a kind of identifier, even by people who do feel, who feel so profoundly that it is a wrong word to use. Another person who's worked on this is Caroline Norma, in terms of other armies which adopt this practice of procuring women, where the state adopts the practice of procuring women for the use of the army. It's widely tolerated, and it's kind of, it's even myths about it, sort of delightful myths about how the sailors are coming on shore, let's go out and get them and so forth. And it's really, the American army is probably the chief or the most well-known practitioner of this practice at the moment. It's a prostitution system in very bold terms. So Christabel examines the basis of this prostitution system, which goes beyond the army. So it's not just saying the state, as she says, procures people for those enlisted in the army, but it procures women rather. Sorry, people. It procures women for the use of citizens non-enlisted citizens, if you like. She examines the basis of the prostitution with a sharpness I think that we really would benefit from today. She notes, for example, that its prostitution system is tied up with a way of educating men. And I'm reminded that in France, under the abolition law of 2016, that part of that law is about educating young people about what prostitution really is and about how it's organised. She notes that men have been educated into prostitution, and prostitution goes way beyond those particular brothels, for example. She says men have been educated such that their minds are choke full of ignorant and unclean superstition as to their own sex nature. In other words, men deceive themselves about who they are. And she says they do this by what she calls brain stains on the brain. Stains on the brain are the stories that men tell and are told about their sexual nature. They're told about what their sexual nature is, what their desires are, what their passions are, and of course also what their entitlements are, what their rights and entitlements are. But long before they get to the rights and entitlements, they're told about what kind of sexual creature they are. And here, this is me speaking, Christabel doesn't talk about pornography, but I think of the stories that pornography tells about men's voracious sexual nature, which they're like an alibi on which men rely to say that they just can't help it. They just got to have it, as if it's some kind of disembodied thing that you get out of a dispensing machine. And we know that these dispensing machines have names, and that name is a woman. Christabel quotes a contemporary doctor, who she doesn't name, who notes that fallen men, and I love that expression, fallen men, because of course the traditional expression was fallen women. Fallen men, by continual stimulation of their sexual passions with erotic thoughts, sensual conversation and literature, and by the rehearsal of lewd stories, produce in themselves and in others who fall under their noxious influence an uncontrollable passion. Worse, as Christabel herself notes, women rehearse these stories too. They tell the stories over and over and over again, like a pornography reel, or like I also think of popular songs. I don't want to sound, here's me saying I don't want to sound puritanical. Sorry, I don't care. But that when we sort of hum along or sing along to songs, or when we catch ourselves walking along in the street and we're kind of singing along about having sex and being subject to sex in particular, whether it's women or men, that's a way of rehearsing these stories. And stories is the story we tell about ourselves, who we are and what we're fit for and what we're not fit for, what we can do and what we can't do, and what a proper woman is and what a proper man is. We no longer sing songs about staying in the kitchen and making sandwiches, or very few of us do. Most of our stories, our songs, our brain stains these days don't involve putting women to work in the barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. Most of our songs that we rehearse concern what we do in the bedroom, how we rehearse our pleasures, our stories of pleasure. Christabel says that what we have to do here then is to begin to tell different stories to ourselves and about ourselves. And she says here, and I'm quoting from her here, "For generations, women have been very silent, but they've thought them all. That silence has given us time to think, and the time has come to put their thoughts into words. It's now the turn of men, who have hitherto done the talking, to listen to what women have to say about life and its problems. One of the thoughts of women," she says, "which has now come to the point of expression, is that prostitution must end. They will be told, we will be told, women will be told, we are told," she says, "that such a thing is impossible." And you know all the variations of that story the story that we're told that it's the oldest profession, that it's inevitable, that men can't do without prostitution. Shamefully, I've heard, and I have heard women say this, I've read it in books by men, but I've also heard women, sometimes my students say this, is that by having prostitutes, men won't won't act badly towards women like themselves. In other words, kind of setting up actually setting up kind of hierarchy of women, those you can do anything to, or those you're entitled to do anything to, even if you don't always exercise your entitlement, and those who you have to be more careful with in that way. That's a shameful story to tell ourselves. So Christabel says, in answer to that, we must say again with the utmost firmness, prostitution must end. We are assured, she says, they women are assured that in the past attempts have been made over and over again to get rid of prostitution, and that such attempts have failed and always will fail so long as the world lasts, because it's the oldest profession and it's inevitable. And you can't change human nature. And men are just like that. Women, she says, have a very simple answer to that argument or that story, and it is, you have never tried to abolish prostitution, and so, of course, you haven't succeeded, because you have never actually tried. She also says that our more general sexual arrangements must change too, because they are not distinct from prostitution. So again, she's attacking that view that prostitution is some kind of, is off there somewhere, you know, that it doesn't have to do with us. It's just a kind of another thing that goes on, but it doesn't involve us in that way. For me, I would say this comes out in particular in the way that rape cases of men who have assaulted women in prostitution, how they are conducted. And they're often conducted in a way that suggests that not merely suggests, they're conducted in a way that explicitly says that a man paid for something, and when he didn't get it, he proceeded to take it. And that there was nothing wrong with that because he had paid. He had paid for something to which he was denied, and so when he was denied, he would take it. The worst thing about that is that juries are very receptive to that story, that prostitution is a matter of paying for something, and that it's like an ordinary old bargain. Just like sex work is work, so is a sex bargain a bargain, and you must keep to it. So if you've paid for certain things, like to choke a woman and she refuses to be choked, that is not a genuine, that's not a genuine reason on her part, and he is entitled to rely on the payment as a form of showing that she consented to that. It's very hard to convict people. It's very hard to convict men for the sexual assault of women in prostitution, whether it's women who are in prostitution or women in prostitution situations, if you see what I mean. So whether they happen in the brothel or out of it, it's always very hard to convict men for that, and they've always got the consent. They've got the consent through payment to rely upon. But what Christabel wants to say is that our arrangements in regard to prostitution must also be accompanied by a change in our general sexual arrangements too. In particular, how we think of marriage, which she says is an alibi for prostitution in many ways. For example, she says this. She says, people are led to reason in this way. A woman who is a wife is one who's made a permanent sex bargain for her maintenance. The woman who's not married may therefore make a temporary bargain of the same kind. So they kind of rely on, there's this reliance on, well, if you can do it in marriage by making a permanent sex bargain and the wife becoming, being a part of her husband, literally a part of her husband by the doctrine of coverture, which didn't see the door until 1992 in England, and a short time before that in Australia, and still hasn't seen the door in many other countries around the world. So people say, well, a woman who's a wife is one who's made a permanent sex bargain for her maintenance. Therefore, the woman who's not married may make a temporary bargain of the same kind, a prostitution bargain. She said this, Christabel said this long before Simone de Beauvoir said so in almost exactly the same words, that marriage is a form of prostitution. But Christabel almost sort of says, well, yes, that's true, but also prostitution is a form of marriage as well. cuts very deeply. So she says our arrangements must change such that women are acknowledged as full equals with men. And this is not just getting the same pay for the same work. One of the examples that Christabel gives of the evils of inequality is the leniency with which assaults on young girls are treated in the courts in particular. And she qualified as a barrister, but being a woman, she was not permitted to practice. And I just wanted to mention that in this case, this is something that is not, again, not widely known about the suffragettes or the suffragette movement, that they were not only concerned, just as Christabel wasn't only concerned with votes or political power, but they were very concerned with the question of sexual assault. And Sheila Jeffries has done work on the campaign waged by suffragettes, against sexual abuse and harassment. We think of harassment as a modern word. It is a modern word, but it does refer to a phenomenon that has been constant throughout our working lives. It's also noteworthy that Adela Pankhurst, who married to Australia, made this a priority when she came here. She and Vida Goldstein separately, but not together, but separately, would actually go on a tour of country courts and take notes about sexual abuse of children cases and how they were conducted and what kinds of excuses were offered. So as long as inequality remains, Christabel notes, women are not recognised as persons. As long as there is prostitution, we are not persons. We can't be. And there is nevertheless a kind of a get out of jail card for us, and that's to become a wife. So the first class of non-persons are called wives. And Christabel said, from now onwards, women must be warned of the fact that marriage is intensely dangerous until such time as men's moral standards are completely changed and they become as chaste and clean living as women. So she draws attention to the effects of venereal disease on women in particular, which is a big step as well. And she says, owing to the ravages that gonorrhea works upon women, womanhood itself has almost come to be looked upon as a disease. I'd cut out the almost there. That way. She writes about the dangers of marriage where men have failed to control the stories they tell themselves, their brain stains, and actually inflict even that first class of women, of non-persons rather, as they even inflict them with syphilis or VD. So that's the life of the first class of these non-persons, who are those who are married. The second class, way down the pole, who don't have a get-out-of-free card of any kind, are prostitutes. Women in prostitution, I would say. Any advance in our progress to personhood or to humanity rests on the relegation of a class of women rests on the end of the relegation of a class of women to this category of prostitutes who are treated as ungilded slaves. Some might be treated as gilded slaves, as like the house slaves, when they're treated slightly better. Or you might say, as John Stuart Mill did, that women in his time, some years before this even, were simply gilded slaves, like the house mammies. Christabel wonders why such a situation is tolerable to us as women, why we put up with it. And it's a very good question. She says, though, that because of the more developed sense of comradeship among women in the suffragette movement, we understand this solidarity. We understand that so long as there exists a huge class of slave women, the more fortunate women cannot live peaceably and contentedly as though all were well. If some women are corrupted and are treated outcasts or treated as outcasts and sacrificed to men's immorality, this concerns all women, and those who are responsible, i.e. men, must be called to account. Whenever I read this book it's a very short book of Christabel's, I always feel ashamed of myself. And I don't just go off and, crouch in the corner and just feel shame and do nothing. But I feel really shocked and ashamed that I should allow myself to think that it's okay to to disregard women who are in prostitution. That I feel ashamed that at any time we should simply pass by prostitution as if it didn't matter in that way. So, but what's important here, and I'm just about to wrap up and to finish, but is that Christabel says what saves us here is not, not the individual sense of shame, or what I would feel of an individual sense of shame, but joining together in the solidarity of other women, that by joining together with other women, we can abolish prostitution. And I think we have come so close until these wretched TRAs came along and diverted so much of our attention from this problem. In 2014, both the European Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe passed resolutions which, broadly speaking, were in favour of the Nordic model. Those motions were passed overwhelmingly. They were also, in the case of the European Parliament, the resolution called at the beginning said that prostitution and forced prostitution, both, so forced prostitution and prostitution in the normal course of prostitution, are forms of slavery. And once you say that something is once you declare that something is a form of slavery in that way, it's all over. It's all because that is a particular type of crime called jus cogens, which means that there is no excuse for it. It is absolutely prohibited in all circumstances. There are no excuses for men's brain stains, for their blue balls, for any kind of other excuse that they might offer for why prostitution is necessary. And yet these resolutions have been passed. France has gone down the Nordic path, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Canada in its own kind of foot-dragging kind of way, Israel, for example, and yet we've lost our way on this question. And I think we've lost our way in so many aspects because we haven't stood together about this, that it's become something that we adopt as an individual position but fail to bring our solidarity to bear when we have the edge and when we have the wind behind us in that way. So I think the last thing that I would say that strikes me most in reading about suffragettes, and Christabel in particular, because it's what I'm talking about today, is not only what they fought for, votes for women and chastity for men, but also the sheer imaginativeness that they dared to imagine, and particularly Christabel dared to imagine at this stage, the abolition of prostitution, not its regulation, not its better working, not cleaning up the women a bit more, making sure that men didn't take home venereal disease from brothels, etc., but rather she advocated the abolition. It has to go. And she advocated that through her ties with other women. It suggests that what she suggests, or what underlies her argument, is that what's important is not only what we argue for, but the forms of action that we forge are as important as our objectives. So we can be for women's rights for as much as and as greatly as we like. And I'm speaking about myself here a little. I was never against women's rights, but I never really fully realized the importance to feminism of solidarity with other women, not just being in favor of certain positions and ideas and perspectives, but being with other women, women acting together, and refusing to accept any limits, refusing to leave any women or some women or one woman behind, that all had to come with us and couldn't be just passed by. Christabel and others drew on the struggle against prostitution that had been formulated in relation to the campaign to abolish the Contagious Diseases Acts in Britain, and they're also in Australia and other colonial countries in the late 19th century. The best way that I can explain the Contagious Diseases Acts is that women in prostitution it was a form of zoning, and that zoning centred around army establishments. So if you've read or seen any number of the productions of Pride and Prejudice, when one of the, I think it's Lydia, is it? I can't remember. When one of the younger Bennet girls elopes with one of the soldiers, that's the type of, that's what they're afraid of, that she has gone to a particular kind of arrangement, which was very common, which was not only good girls gone wrong in the case of Lydia, but in the case of women in prostitution. And the idea was to corral women into these special places near military camps so they could be useful in that way, but so that they could also be controlled and they could be inspected and cleaned up, etc., and recycled in that way. The contagious diseases allowed that to happen in, as I say, in Britain and Australia in the late 19th centuries. And the campaign to abolish the Contagious Diseases Acts, particularly by other women who prior to the suffragettes, I suppose, managed to bring about the abolition of the Contagious Diseases Act, but not to abolish prostitution itself. The struggle to abolish prostitution has a long radical pedigree across Europe. The women of the Paris Commune of 1871, for example, fought for abolition. And this kind of struggle for abolition, that we know what we need to do. We know that we don't want just a reform or a band-aid here or there, but we need to abolish the system. And when the prostitution system falls, then patriarchy will fall, because it lies at the center of it. It isn't just one other institution of patriarchy. It is at the center of it itself. It's not peripheral to patriarchy at all. And the struggle against that sort of comes in and out of history and can be seen again in the campaign of the organization Free Women in the Spanish Republic and the Civil War. So we sort of tend to, and I think we were having a moment, another moment, an abolitionist moment about 10 years ago, and we seem to have lost that a little bit as well. So I read this book as a call to us to remember those moments and to draw on them. Sometimes we say that we stand on the shoulders of women like the suffragettes or like Christabel, but I'd rather say we should stand beside them. And as a male writer says, when we win, and we will win on prostitution, even the dead will not be untouched by our victory. Even the dead will benefit from our victory in that way. So I'm going to finish there now, and I'm happy to answer any questions at all or to any criticisms, etc. And I'm just signalling to Joe that I'm wrapping up.
Yeah. So I wonder if Sheila Jeffries, I think you're here in the panelists group. Would you be okay to come on and chat to Helen a little bit? Great, Sheila's here, so I'm going to add her, add spotlight. There we are. And fantastic. And then also, Helen, there are a couple of slides that we didn't show. So shall I quickly show them?
Yes, they're just really, I mean, my slides, I didn't want to put too much on the slides because I'm not so confident that things will all go well on these things. So I make them so that they're not strictly necessary to the talk. But there's these other slides just of somebody selling the Great Scourge, and then of Christabel in there, and Emmeline, her mother, as well, in one of them, and then and the last of the Spanish, the women of the Free Women.
Right. Okay. So over to you two.
Yes, and I was thinking as you were talking, it was lovely to hear you talk about the book, because I haven't looked at it for decades, really, not since I wrote Spinster and Her Enemies. And I can absolutely remember how extraordinary the book seemed to me, because it was so radical. I mean, there were quite a lot of radical women around at that time, but this book went above and beyond. I mean, it was marvelous in the strength of its analysis and what she was prepared to say. And I don't know whether you experienced similar astonishment, but
I do. And the other person, if I could just also point to another person who I get a similar kind of astonishment from, is Josephine Butler.
Yes.
And who had been involved in the campaign against the Contagious Diseases Act. And I kind of, look, because I've never been educated properly, you know, which is as a political philosopher, as a political theorist, I only ever read men, because women didn't write anything.
That's
so,
right.
you know, nobody ever introduced me to Josephine Butler. And one day I came across this book by Josephine Butler, and I was just blown off my feet. I had to sort of, I lost my breath. And it said, it wasn't just, you know, that she made some good comments, which she did, but that she had this analysis about personal security and the security and standing of women, and what it meant to deprive them of that, and how a political system could not be just, how that was an essential part of the political system. Sorry, I haven't explained it very well, but it's another long story. But
yes, and we should talk about Josephine Butler, and maybe in the future we should talk about her.
Yes, I think it would be great. But again, somebody who's dismissed as, she's dismissed as a kind of Puritan religious kind of figure. And also the other thing is that she ran temperance campaigns. And, that's another thing, that really is a killer of women's voices, is to say, you don't drink. And when you don't drink, everybody kind of, oh my God, we can't listen to you. And, there's something sort of deeply morally suspect about people who don't drink. And when these temperance campaigns, which were directed at controlling the violence of men.
That's right.
They weren't directed primarily, because wine didn't taste so good, or I don't know, whatever, but they were directed at how they incited the violence of men and how they justified, oh, he got drunk and so he, that sort of stuff. So
yes, yeah. The Women's Temperance League came exactly from that.
Mm.
Yes, and I remember, her name's not coming to me now, but in Spinster and Her Enemies, I talk about this woman who was going around giving out white ribbons to men. She addressed huge audiences of men, telling them they had to stop doing sex outside marriage, basically, and control themselves, control their lust. And they could all walk up to the front and get the white ribbon from her and pin it to themselves. I mean, extraordinary stuff. Of course, they had religion to help them. Nobody's into religion now, but the religion was simply a way of doing a campaign that was crucially important to women. So, I mean, it was kind of extraordinary stuff.
Yeah, and I think this book, I look, the book is so short, that it's really, it's Christabel's book is so short that and so powerful that, and again, not just for the comments that it makes, but for the whole kind of analysis of, and not many people, I don't know many people at all who place prostitution at the heart of the, patriarchy. It's kind of one institution among others.
People don't want to think about it. They constantly just put it on one side, so they can't possibly say that it's at the heart. They can't look at it.
Yeah, and to say that we can't rest until it's gone.
Mm-hmm. And of course, unfortunately, the First World War then took place, and Christabel became a supporter of the war, and that separated her off from other feminists. And that really put a stop to what was this building campaign against prostitution, because by the 20s, of course, there are very different politics, and there are all these sort of libertarian, socialist, feminist types who were supporting men and supporting their sexuality. And as I say in Spinster and Her Enemies, so much of it got squashed and forgotten. But it was an extraordinary moment, the moment 1913 when that book came out. And I've talked in the chat about Lawrence Houseman's pamphlet at the same time, The Sex War and Women's Suffrage. So they were talking about sex war. They were talking about male sexuality. And it was quite generally being talked about. So she wasn't completely on her own. But all of that came to an end, unfortunately.
But see, somebody like John Stuart Mill, who I've studied, I mean, he analyzes prostitution, but he never, and he does it quite, I mean, as far as I'm in my opinion, he does it well, but he never places that at the heart. And when he talks about the campaigns for the vote, this is in the 1860s and 1870s, he says we need to segregate that campaign against prostitution, which he was against and he wanted abolished. He said we need to segregate that from the campaign for votes, because it could turn people against women, the women arguing for votes. And so, again, implying, well, it's important to do it, but it's not essential. I mean, it's not. No, it's important and essential, but it's not.
But that shows how essential it was, in fact.
Critical, do you know what I mean? It's not the linchpin. And I think, yeah. I think we have to go back and recover that kind of drive.
Yes, I think so. I think it's interesting that you say that there was 10 years ago a bit more momentum in the struggle against prostitution and against pornography. There's no momentum in that struggle now, because that's absolutely crucial to men. Absolutely.
Mm. Mm. And one of the things that I find about prostitution, pornography too, if I could just, I was just thinking about this when I was reading Christabel again, is that the way that it's used now is not prior to commission of acts of violence against women, but the way that it's used now is it's just part of life. So if you look at various cases of murders, which I've been doing, which is fabulous fun, which have involved pornography, and more of them do involve pornography because they don't always ask about that in cases, especially where somebody pleads guilty, but they involve somebody consuming pornography during the assault on the woman as well. So it's on there. And then after as well, continuing to consume pornography. So it's just, the killing is actually a part of the pornography, you know, and it's especially where, and this is exacerbated where the killing or the assault is on women in prostitution, either in a brothel or in another situation. A case in Sydney where a young woman was killed in the city. Again, the same pattern. He consumed pornography. He continued to consume it as he killed her, and the first thing that he did when he left was to consume more. It was just continuous.
But it's a bit hard because it's too frightening for women to look at, acknowledge, and watch. To know that they're in relationships with men, most of whom, the great majority of whom, use pornography, if not every day, then a great deal, and see women like that. It's just too hard to recognize, and I think that's why pornography is no longer so actually central to what we're looking at, but it has to be. It has to be.
Well, I think if you consider it as a form of prostitution, like Megan Tyler does in some of her works, then yeah, I think you can get that gets to the heart of it as well.
Yes, absolutely.
I just mentioned Dorothea, I think, put in the chat, there is a link to the book, The Great Scourge, if anybody wanted to get that, and you can download it. I don't know where I didn't see the link, Dorothea, but it can be also, you can find it on archive.org, archive.org, and it's a useful resource for those kinds of things too. Anyway. Well, I mean, well worth your time to read. Yeah. Are they?
Absolutely.
Thanks, Dorothea. Yeah.
So I'm going to assume we've finished now. So thank you so much to Helen Pringle and Sheila Jeffries for coming in and talking at the end, and see everybody next week or maybe in the breakout rooms. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone.